a comprehensive analytical narrative on institutional ethics and constitutional governance. Professor Raskin, you have dedicated an extensive and highly visible portion of your professional career to the act of lecturing the American citizenry regarding the intricacies of ethics, the necessity of personal and public accountability, and the foundational doctrines inherent in our constitutional framework. You have even authored a scholarly volume concerning the preservation and endurance of democracy, which is viewed by many as a profoundly moving and significant piece of literature. However, in light of your public persona and your status as a moral arbiter, I am compelled to present one remarkably straightforward yet devastating question for your consideration. During the protracted duration of 8 months, when you were intentionally withholding the details of your spouse's substantial financial fortune from the American people, which specific constitutional principle or ethical doctrine were you ostensibly following? These particular words lingered in the heavy atmosphere of the room, appearing sharp, precisely calculated, and remarkably impactful in their delivery. This confrontation took place during a primetime town hall event broadcast on CNN, where the studio audience was packed so densely that the resulting tension could be felt radiating through the space like a physical heat. On the left side of the auditorium, individuals were seen with buttons signifying their political resistance pinned firmly to their jackets, while others clutched their public radio tote bags with intensity, and many wore shirts dedicated to the defense of democracy, in various shades of ideological outrage. On the opposite side of the room, the space was occupied by individuals wearing traditional political caps with pride, while historical flags were draped over their shoulders, representing a distinct segment of the electorate that remains vocal and firm in its convictions, referencing slogans that have become synonymous with modern political movements. This setting represented a microcosm of two distinct Americas, both occupying the same physical space and preparing to witness a significant political and moral reckoning. The moderator, Jake Tapper, sat positioned between the high factions, likely sensing that he had essentially lost control of the proceedings before they had even properly commenced. It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not going to be a standard moderated discussion. Instead, it was unfolding into something resembling a formal and rigorous prosecution. JD Vance stood at the center of the stage, appearing composed, remarkably still, and possessing that specific military posture that never quite fades away, regardless of how many years one spends wearing professional suits instead of a service uniform. He presented the demeanor of a seasoned prosecutor who had spent years arguing complex cases in front of rigorous judges who were known for their intolerance of legal incompetence. He was the graduate of Yale Law School who had never lost sight of his origins or the specific demographic of people he was truly committed to representing. Across from him stood Jamie Raskin, a professor of constitutional law with 25 years of experience teaching at American University and a graduate of Harvard Law prior to that distinguished tenure. He was widely recognized as the lead manager for impeachment proceedings and a prominent member of the January 6th committee, often viewed as the intellectual and moral compass of the Democratic Party. He was considered by many to be a dedicated crusader for ethical standards. As the inquiry began, he made a slight adjustment to his spectacles, which served as a subtle gesture of nervousness that did not escape the notice of the audience. Vance observed this specific tell and noted it for future reference, understanding that such signs of discomfort would be useful as the evening progressed. Vance then addressed the crowd, stating that the reason for the gathering was that Professor Raskin holds very firm and vocal opinions regarding ethical conduct, conflicts of interest, the internal workings of the Supreme Court, the actions of Donald Trump, and the general state of corruption within the government. Raskin had authored numerous opinion pieces, delivered countless speeches, initiated formal complaints, and conducted various legislative hearings on these very subjects. He is frequently referred to by his supporters as the moral voice of the legislature and the constitutional conscience of his party, the very ethics crusader who insists on holding those in power to account. Allow that thought to resonate for a moment within the context of our current political climate. However, a fascinating and deeply troubling contradiction emerges. While the professor was occupied with lecturing the nation on the importance of ethics, he seemingly failed to adhere to those very standards within his own household. Federal statutes are quite clear in requiring the disclosure of a spouse's income and various assets, a fundamental rule that is essentially at the level of a high school civics course. Yet, Professor Raskin, who has spent a quarter-century teaching law students about government ethics, transparency, and the sacred obligations of public servants to be honest with the American people, seemed to struggle with this basic requirement. After another intentional and extensive pause, Vance drove the point home. It took the professor 8 months, 8 full months, to inform the American public that his spouse had received over $1 million in equity from a corporation with significant and deep-seated ties to the Federal Reserve. Vance argued that such a delay is not merely an oversight or a simple mistake. It constitutes a clear and documented violation of established rules. Therefore, he proposed that they engage in a discussion about ethics, since it is the professor's preferred topic, but focus on the professor's own record. The initial argument was established, and the rhetorical trap was prepared for the professor. Professor Raskin responded in a manner typical of an academic when faced with a challenge, immediately pivoting to his prepared remarks and lecturing the audience on the constitutional prerequisites for ethical governance. He spoke of the original vision of the founders regarding a transparent and republican form of government. He invoked the wisdom of James Madison concerning the principle that no individual should serve as a judge in their own legal matter, and cited the warnings of Thomas Jefferson regarding the dangers of corruption. He further mentioned Alexander Hamilton's vocal support for accountability within public office. His voice possessed that specific academic quality, the tone of a patient educator explaining intricate constitutional theories to those he perceived as having simpler minds who could not possibly grasp such nuances. He projected the image of an intellectual who was secure in his superior knowledge and moral authority, believing he had studied history and law more deeply than anyone else in the room. On the left side of the auditorium, audience members nodded in agreement, seeing him as a symbol of thoughtful and principled leadership. They viewed him as the mature voice in the room, the adult presence capable of navigating the storms of political discourse. Meanwhile, Vance simply stood with his arms crossed, listening patiently for nearly a full minute, while the professor built his momentum. He allowed the professor to grow comfortable in his role as the narrator of the Founding Fathers' historical achievements, moving through a rotation of Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton. Then, with a deliberate and slow motion, Vance reached into his jacket and retrieved a single document, a financial disclosure form that had been filed in the late summer of the previous year. This was a matter of public record that any citizen could easily access. He did not interrupt the professor, but merely held the document high enough so that the cameras and the audience could clearly identify it. The professor noticed the document, and his recitation of Madison's principles came to an abrupt halt as his hand moved toward his glasses in a quick, almost subconscious adjustment. It was the return of that nervous tell, a realization that something was about to go very wrong for him. Vance began to speak in a calm and even tone, using the voice of a prosecutor that does not require excessive volume to command attention. He noted that he held the professor's financial disclosure, a public document available for any citizen to review online. He mentioned it was filed in the late summer of the previous year, and admitted that the content of the disclosure was fairly standard material for a wealthy individual. It showed the typical portfolio of assets, income, and investments one might expect from someone who has served in Congress for many years. There was nothing particularly shocking about the majority of the information provided in the document. Vance paused to let the anticipation in the room build, before pointing out that the most interesting aspect of the disclosure was not what was included, but rather what was conspicuously absent. He focused on what the professor had failed to disclose to the American public, suggesting that this was where the narrative became truly compelling and revealing. The atmosphere in the room shifted as people leaned forward, sensing that this was no longer merely an academic debate, but a serious investigation into conduct. Vance sought to clarify his understanding of federal law, which is quite simple. If a spouse receives income or assets exceeding $1,000 from a single source, it must be disclosed. Furthermore, this disclosure must occur promptly, typically within a matter of weeks, or perhaps a month, rather than a year later, when it becomes convenient, or only after uncomfortable questions are raised by investigative journalists or opposing political groups. The rule is meant to ensure transparency, a concept that should be familiar to anyone with even a basic understanding of civic duties and public service. As Raskin attempted to intervene, Vance continued his line of questioning, reminding the audience that, as a professor of constitutional law for 25 years, Raskin was responsible for teaching students about the very rules that govern public officials and the sacred trust owed to the citizens. He suggested that Raskin knew these regulations better than almost anyone else, as he was the one who graded others on their comprehension of them. These were not obscure or complex legal statutes. They were foundational elements of ethics law. The audience members on the left began to appear less comfortable as the direction of the argument became clear. Vance then detailed the specifics. Raskin's spouse, Sarah Bloom Raskin, had served on the board of a financial technology firm and was compensated for that role with nearly 200,000 shares of stock. Vance emphasized that this was a significant amount of equity, far more than most Americans would ever hope to accumulate in several lifetimes. He allowed that figure to settle in the minds of the audience before noting that those shares were eventually sold. The resulting compensation exceeded $1 million. He highlighted that this was an amount of money that most working families would not see in 30 years of hard labor. It was a life-changing sum acquired from a corporate board position. The room fell silent as the audience began to process the scale of the transaction. Vance then proposed that they perform the necessary calculations together, noting that federal law requires disclosure within a very short time frame. However, Raskin had filed the necessary paperwork 8 months after the sale took place. This was not a delay of a few weeks or even a couple of months. It was a gap of over 240 days. Vance argued that this was not a mere oversight, but a deliberate act of concealment. Raskin's hand moved to his glasses for the third time, a gesture that was now obvious to everyone watching in the room and at home. Vance then shifted the focus from a bureaucratic error to a matter of personal character, inviting the audience to imagine the perspective of an average American who works a standard job, earning a modest annual salary. He described the excitement such a person might feel upon receiving a $500 bonus, noting that such an amount represents real utility for groceries, bills, or a rare dinner out at a nice restaurant. He pointed out that to the average citizen, $500 is a significant sum that matters in their daily lives. The members of the audience on the right nodded in solidarity with this sentiment, recognizing the reality of the working class. He further explained that these citizens report every dollar they earn on their taxes because they are aware of the consequences of failing to do so, such as audits and penalties from the IRS. They follow the rules because they are mandatory, not because of some inherent sainthood. Turning back to Raskin, Vance contrasted this with the professor's situation. While ordinary citizens are meticulous with small amounts, the professor's spouse received a fortune from a stock sale and remained silent for nearly 3/4 of a year. During those many months, the American people, who provide the professor's salary and place their trust in him, were kept in the dark regarding this windfall. The audience on the left remained quiet, feeling the weight of the discomfort. Vance noted that during this period of silence, the professor was actually quite active and visible in the public eye. He was at the forefront of the second impeachment of the former president, delivering impassioned speeches about the rule of law and the importance of holding the powerful accountable. He frequently appeared on television to lecture the nation about ethics, corruption, and the duty of public servants to adhere to the law. Vance paused to allow the perceived hypocrisy of the situation to be fully recognized by the audience. He noted that Raskin was also serving on the January 6th committee, making prime-time appearances to discuss the defense of democracy and the upholding of high standards for public service. His voice was often filled with a sense of moral authority as he instructed the nation on the principles of the American system. Yet, during that entire time, Vance argued, the professor was himself in violation of federal ethics statutes. While he was demanding transparency from others, he was concealing his own family's financial gains. While he spoke of accountability, he was avoiding it for himself. A voice from the audience expressed a sense of betrayal and disgust. Vance then addressed the inevitable defense, the tragic loss of Raskin's son, Tommy. Vance expressed genuine sympathy for the tragedy, acknowledging that losing a child is an unimaginable pain that fundamentally changes a person. He stated that no one would ever seek to diminish that grief or question its reality. However, he pointed out that even the ethics complaints filed against the professor acknowledged this loss and suggested that he be given a degree of latitude. Nevertheless, Vance highlighted a critical point. If the professor was capable of fulfilling the demanding duties of leading an impeachment charge and maintaining a high public profile, it was reasonable to expect that he could also manage the necessary financial paperwork. The room became incredibly still as Vance listed the professor's activities during that period: leading impeachment, making House floor speeches, conducting televised interviews on major news networks, and even writing a book for a significant advance. Vance argued that while Raskin was capable of all these professional endeavors, he somehow found the filing of ethics paperwork regarding a $1 million transaction to be an overwhelming task. He suggested that the grief seemed to be applied selectively. Raskin attempted to respond with a defensive tone, mentioning the loss of his son again, but Vance reiterated his respect for that loss, while maintaining that the grief did not prevent the professor from performing any other aspect of his job. He argued that the failure to disclose the money was not a result of grief, but of convenience. The silence that followed was palpable and heavy. Vance allowed the moment to linger, giving the audience time to process the weight of the evidence and the clear, documented hypocrisy. He then posed a direct yes or no question. Did the professor violate federal financial disclosure law by waiting 8 months to report the income? Raskin appeared to struggle for words, attempting to pivot to the technicalities of filing requirements and the broader context of the law. Vance interrupted, reminding him that this was not a law exam or a hypothetical classroom scenario, and pressed for a simple answer to a simple question. After a long and uncomfortable pause, Raskin eventually conceded that the filing was indeed late. Vance seized on this admission, pointing out that while the professor was lecturing the nation on accountability, he was failing to meet those standards himself. He was investigating corruption in others while being in violation of ethics rules. Vance then turned to the camera to speak directly to the American people, using the phrase, "rules for thee, but not for you," to describe the professor's approach to governance. He argued that this was the very essence of the swamp in Washington, an individual who preaches ethics while violating them. The audience on the right erupted in applause, feeling that someone was finally exposing these contradictions. Meanwhile, the audience on the left was quiet, some even checking their devices to verify the facts, only to find that the financial disclosures and ethics complaints were indeed matters of public record. Social media was quickly filled with discussions of the exchange, and various news outlets began playing the admission on a loop. While some attempted to defend the professor by citing his personal tragedy, many found the timeline and the facts to be too clear to ignore. The fact that he was leading an impeachment while withholding his own violations was an undeniable reality. Even small donors who had supported his campaigns felt a sense of betrayal, realizing that the person they thought was fighting for their values was concealing a fortune. However, Vance indicated that this was only the first part of the discussion. He suggested that the source of the money was even more concerning than the delay in its disclosure. He promised to discuss how the professor's spouse had acquired the funds, involving government connections and special favors. He teased that the next round of the discussion would make the initial violation seem minor in comparison. Raskin tried to regain his composure and shift the topic back to safer territory, such as the conduct of Supreme Court justices. Vance refused to allow the change of subject, insisting on following the trail of the $1 million. He argued that the money did not appear by magic, but was the result of a specific set of circumstances involving a private company. He noted that, as Raskin became increasingly uncomfortable, his habit of adjusting his glasses became a point of amusement for Motso Ngui in the audience. Vance then detailed how Raskin's spouse had moved from a powerful position as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury directly to the board of a private financial technology firm called Reserve Trust. He pointed out the irony of Raskin's long-standing criticism of the revolving door between government and industry. The professor had frequently held and authored articles condemning the practice of former officials using their connections to enrich themselves and their new employers. Yet, his own spouse had made that transition in just a month. Vance describes this as setting up permanent residence in the revolving door, rather than just passing through it. He then explained the core of the issue. The company wanted a master account with the Federal Reserve, a rare and highly valuable asset that allows a firm to move money directly through the government system without a middleman bank. The initial application for this account was denied by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City because it did not meet the necessary requirements. However, following that denial, Raskin's spouse made a phone call to the president of that specific Fed bank. Vance highlights the hypocrisy of a constitutional law professor who had spent years attacking such behavior. Former government officials using their titles and relationships to benefit private interests. He argued that this was the textbook definition of the very corruption Raskin claimed to oppose. Despite Raskin's attempts to defend his spouse's qualifications, Vance maintains that the problem was the use of those connections for private gain. He noted that after the phone call, the company's reapplication was suddenly approved, making it the only financial technology firm of its kind to receive such access. He contrasts this special treatment with the experience of regular Americans who struggle to get basic support for their small businesses and often find themselves without connections or recourse. Vance concluded that for the Raskin family, a single phone call was all it took to change a denial into an approval. He describes the $1 million stock sale as the monetization of relationships built during public service. He argued that the Federal Reserve's subsequent explanatory statements were merely an attempt to normalize an unusual situation. He also pointed out that the controversy was so significant that even members of Raskin's own party could not support his spouse's subsequent nomination to the Federal Reserve. leading to its collapse. The room buzzed as the audience processed the details of the revolving door narrative. Vance reiterated that Raskin's actions represented the exact opposite of the public service he preached. He moved on to a third area of concern: the professor's conduct on the January 6th committee. He accused Raskin of discarding the very constitutional principles he taught in his classes, such as due process and the rights of the accused. He argued that the committee's proceedings were fundamentally unfair and lacked the basic protections guaranteed by the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Vance criticized the process by which the committee was formed, noting that the Speaker of the House had rejected the minority party's nominees in an unprecedented move. This results in a committee composed entirely of individuals who already agreed on the conclusion before any evidence was heard. He describes the televised hearings as edited show trials carefully designed to present only one side of the story. He accused the committee of excluding evidence that contradicted their narrative, such as information regarding security failures or the authorization of National Guard troops. He argued that in a legitimate legal proceeding, the accused has the right to present a defense and cross-examine witnesses' rights that were conspicuously absent in the committee's process. He challenged the professor to explain how he could reconcile his academic teachings with his legislative actions. Raskin's reaction was one of visible frustration and anger. Vance also raised the issue of evidence destruction, claiming that the committee had deleted records and transcripts before the opposition could review them. He argued that such actions are typically associated with a consciousness of guilt rather than a desire for transparency. Finally, Vance addressed the criminal referrals made by the committee, noting that they were issued without providing the accused an opportunity to present a defense. He characterized this as the behavior of a tyrant who believes that rights only apply to their enemies. He concluded that Raskin's career was defined by a consistent pattern of rules for thee, but not for me. He argued that the professor was an elite who viewed himself as above the laws he insisted others follow. The impact of these revelations was significant, leading to renewed scrutiny of the professor's conduct and potential professional consequences. Even moderate voters and academic colleagues began to distance themselves, troubled by the documented inconsistencies in his record. Vance's final message was a call for accountability for all public servants, regardless of party affiliation, and a demand for an end to the double standards that protect. He urged the public to share information and remain vigilant against the systemic corruption that undermines the foundations of the Republic. Part V. The fourth round. The Supreme Court, Paradox, and Ethics Projection. The inquiry then transitioned into what J.D. Vance characterized as the fourth round of this intellectual and moral confrontation, focusing on Professor Raskin's long-standing crusade against the ethical standards of the Supreme Court of the United States. Vance noted that while the professor frequently seeks the spotlight to attack the judiciary, this specific area would ultimately provide the most compelling evidence of his own contradictions. Professor Raskin, believing he had returned to familiar and safe intellectual territory, launched into a prepared and rhythmic recitation of his grievances against several conservative justices. He spoke with great intensity about Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Samuel Alito, citing luxury travel, private jet flights, and undisclosed gifts from individuals such as Harlan Crow. His voice regained its characteristic moral authority, sounding like a concerned citizen scholar worried about the very integrity of the nation's highest institutions. On the left side of the room, the audience responded with a standing ovation, viewing Raskin as their champion who was willing to speak truth to power. However, the atmosphere changed abruptly when Vance began to offer slow, deliberate, and clearly sarcastic applause, which was quickly joined by the audience on the right. Vance smiled a dangerous smile and sought to clarify Raskin's position, Did the professor believe that it was essential for Supreme Court justices to disclose the financial interests and income of their spouses to maintain public trust? Raskin, confident in his stance, nodded in absolute agreement. It was at this moment that the rhetorical trap snapped shut. Vance produced a letter that Raskin and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had recently sent to Chief Justice John Roberts. In this forceful document, they demanded answers regarding the court's recusal standards and questioned what steps were being taken to address glaring episodes of political bias and lack of disclosure. Vance pointed out the staggering audacity of this demand, noting that at the very moment the professor was lecturing the Chief Justice about disclosure, he had been concealing his own family's million-dollar fortune for over 8 months. He characterized this not as a matter of principle, but as a blatant act of projection, a guilty man attacking others to distract from his own documented violations. Using Raskin's own words from the letter, Vance highlighted the professor's accusation that certain justices were free to ignore the ethics rules and depart from the truth on their mandatory disclosure forms. Vance argued that these phrases described Raskin's own conduct with startling precision, as he had also ignored rules and departed from the truth by filing his disclosures 240 days late. The confrontation intensified as Vance referenced a hearing the professor had titled High Court, Low Standards, during which Raskin mocked justices for having billionaire sugar daddies who provided gifts and automobiles. Vance asked the room if there was any meaningful difference between a sugar daddy and a spouse receiving over $1 million in stock immediately after a favorable government phone call. He repeatedly used Raskin's own phrase, "rules for thee and not for me," to describe the professor's career. He argued that Raskin demands accountability from the judiciary while refusing to be accountable himself, and demands transparency while operating in the shadows. The audience on the right erupted in cheers as the ethics preacher was judged by his own standards. The immediate fallout of this exchange was devastating for Raskin's reputation. Conservative media outlets began playing the clip of his own words being used against him on a loop, and Republican senators began citing the Raskin standard whenever the professor called for new ethics hearings. Even among progressive groups, a sense of disillusionment began to spread, as the betrayal of trust felt more significant than any Republican attack. Raskin's moral authority was effectively neutralized. His accusations now rang hollow because his own house was demonstrably on fire. Part Vs. The fifth round: oversight, obstruction, and the Biden family. The final round of the debate addressed the professor's role as the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, a position that carries the constitutional responsibility to check executive power. Vance pointed out that while Raskin teaches his students that congressional oversight is an essential function of a healthy republic, his actual conduct tells a different story. He argued that Raskin's oversight only applies to his political enemies, while he serves as a protective shield for his political allies. Vance opened a thick folder containing bank records and committee transcripts that documented millions of dollars flowing from foreign entities in China, Romania, and Ukraine to various members of the Biden family through a complex network of shell companies. Vance listed the evidence piece by piece, describing each as a hammer blow to the professor's credibility. He noted that when Chairman James Comer presented bank records showing payments to 9 different family members, Raskin's response was to dismiss it as a conspiracy theory. When a $200,000 canceled check from James Biden to Joe Biden was revealed, Raskin called it a thoroughly demolished lie. Vance asked how a documented bank record could be demolished, arguing that Raskin was choosing to prioritize party loyalty over his constitutional duty to the American people. He characterized the professor's actions not as an investigation that found nothing, but as an active obstruction that prevented anything from being found in the first place. Vance argued that this behavior represents everything Americans hate about Washington, the swamp protecting its own, while the average citizen is subjected to the full weight of the law. He contrasted the leniency shown to the powerful with the scrutiny faced by regular taxpayers who face penalties and audits for the smallest errors. He concluded that Raskin was not performing oversight, but was instead an accomplice to corruption, choosing his political career over his oath to the Constitution. Part 7. The Final Judgment and the Path Forward. In a final summary that counted each scandal as a nail in the professor's political coffin, Vance reviewed the 5 rounds of the debate. Round 1. The 8-month concealment of $1 million fortune while lecturing others on transparency. Round 2. The revolving door corruption, where government connections were monetized for personal profit. Round 3. The destruction of evidence and denial of due process during the January 6th investigation. Round 4. The hypocrisy of attacking the Supreme Court for the same violations he committed himself. Round 5. The obstruction of legitimate oversight to protect the powerful members of his own party. Vance delivered a final judgment, calling the professor a fraud whose credentials were not supported by his character. He argued that degrees from Harvard and decades of teaching mean nothing if they are not accompanied by honesty and integrity. He concluded by telling the professor, "Class dismissed. You failed," as the room exploded in a mixture of cheers and stunned silence. The broader lessons derived from this confrontation are profound for the future of American governance. First, the debate signaled the death of credential worship, as voters began to realize that an elite pedigree does not guarantee ethical conduct. Second, it provided documented proof that the swamp, a system where elites protect elites against the interests of regular Americans, is a reality rather than a conspiracy theory. Third, it highlighted the urgent need for term limits to prevent politicians from becoming so disconnected from the people they represent that they believe they are above the law. Finally, it demonstrated that the most effective weapon against institutional corruption is the truth, spoken clearly and backed by undeniable evidence. The path forward for the American people, as outlined in the closing statements, involves a rejection of double standards and a demand for a single system of justice that applies equally to everyone. This requires voting out career politicians who enrich themselves through public service, and replacing them with individuals of character who will fight for the interests of their constituents. Vance urged the public to share the truth of this exposure far and wide, arguing that the ethics preacher was only the first domino to fall in a larger effort to restore honest government to the United States.